Hello, listeners. Welcome to the 119th episode of the Supporting Child Caregivers Podcast. I'm Alexandra Harrison. The Supporting Child Caregivers Podcast is a source of helpful information for parents, health workers, teachers, and other child caregivers across the globe. Today, we are delighted to host Lori Hogenkamp, the pioneering mind behind evolutionary stress framework. Drawing from her personal journey and extensive research in psychoneuroimmunology, neuroscience, and mental health, Lori has fundamentally reshaped our understanding of stress and neurodiversity, which is, of course, our subject. With the evolutionary stress framework, she aims to facilitate a paradigm shift in scientific understanding and to enable more personalized health strategies. So, Lori, I'm really eager to talk about your evolutionary stress framework and the rest of your work. And I hope that you'll give us some insights into neurodiversity, something about the experience of neurodiverse individuals, given, of course, that each individual describing themselves as neurodiverse must have their own unique experience. And also, especially for our listeners, I would love you to give some insights to parents and other caregivers of what we might call neurodiverse children.
Yeah, I think sometimes we talk about neurodiverse and neurodivergent as one part of the language. So there's different definitions. For me, when I use neurodiverse, I include everyone. So just that we know that there's neurodiverse and neurotypical and neurodivergent.
That's a really important distinction.
Yes,
I'm really happy to know that. Yes.
Yeah. So when we think of neurodiversity, we do think of all minds. One of the key points of the neurodiversity movement has been that we shouldn't be pathologizing differences in behavior and differences in the way the brain works and learning and cognitive styles. Mm-hmm. And what that brought to light for me is that if we're not doing this, if we're not looking at things in a pathology method and a deficiency model, what's really happening? I came from learning about stress and my psychology and psychoneuroimmunology back in the 90s. And I was fascinated by human behavior. I'm neurodivergent myself. I have an autism diagnosis and an ADHD. And I struggled all growing up. I didn't understand why there was nothing wrong with me, but something was really wrong all the time, that I was having these meltdowns, that I would stop functioning language, that I couldn't understand what people were saying, and just struggles all through my childhood. So when I went to school and learned more and more about the brain, I read a book called The Healing Brain by Robert Ornstein, I think my sophomore year after having a burnout, and I was hospitalized. And I switched my majors from systems analysis, I was a computer major, over to brain science because I was fascinated. So I approached neurodiversity from a slightly different perspective during the same time frame that neurodiversity was coming out. So neurodiversity is about not pathologizing different ways of being. And I came up with the term peripheral minds.
Oh, wow.
Because there was a book called The Brain Chemistry Diet. And Dr. Michael Lesser wrote this book. He was one of the pioneers in orthomolecular psychology. And he said most of his patients were of a stoic type. And when I read the Stoic, the first time I read it, I said, oh, that's me. I'm this person that can do everything and social butterfly and all of these things, until I read the Dreamer profile. And I said, oh, I'm not a Stoic at all. I've just been conditioned to want to be a Stoic my entire life.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And I realized I was trying to be normal. I had it in my mind that I was going to be the best version of normal I could be. And when I realized that's not even my personality is only 3% of the population. It was like this big light bulb went off. And he talked about how what we think of as mental disorders are actually personalities in distress. And so I kind of went down that journey
I completely relate to that.
Yeah. What will this
Anybody,
look like?
when they're really stressed, can act anyway.
Right. And then when we start really peeling back the onion of our medical model, and it's based on germ theory model of medicine, which is a disease model, and we don't use ecosystems. So I thought it would just be one personality that would be most susceptible to autism. And I realized it was all 5 personalities other than the stoic. So the neurotypical is really a smaller percentage of the population. It'd be 30 to 40%, depending on the culture. And then the rest is more divergent. So to me, for my definition, that's a neurodivergent. It's 60% of the population that thinks differently than the homogenized whole. Now, there's nothing wrong with the neurotypical. It's just a different neurotype. But because we had that framework of science, we needed a normalization to measure everything to. So the average, because in any ecosystem, the majority is going to be stress stabilizing, and they're socially oriented. They hold us together. They're the salt of the earth, as we'd say in my little small town. So there's a value there. But when we thought, and we're looking for the healthiest version and the healthiest stress stabilized person, we mistook that for the ideal health. And that's a lot of where normal came from. What's normal? It's a neurotypical. But even what's right for a neurotypical and the average person or the normal person isn't best for everyone. And that's where neurodiverse comes in, is we have to start thinking of everyone as neurodiverse and having their own strengths and challenges.
That's
and
right.
those approaches. Yeah.
And also normal it's not only not right for everyone, it's not right for all of us.
Correct.
Because we need people who think differently.
Yeah, we keep thinking of survival of the fittest, and that was a misinterpretation of Darwin. He would talk more about the efficiency, but it's about the cooperation. There's a wonderful research study by Helen Taylor talking about complementary cognitions, saying we evolved because we had multiple different types of personalities and strengths and weaknesses all throughout society. And so the neurotypicals depend on us and we depend on them, and it's supposed to be this grand conglomeration of getting along and using and sharing each other's talents and gifts. And instead, for the last 100, 200 years, we made it a competition about becoming the best normal because we thought that that was the ideal and the healthiest way to be. So we've structured our entire medical model really on a one-size-fits-all phenomenon that doesn't fit anyone.
It's so interesting, and this may be a little bit of a tangent, but since I am so interested in culture, the thought came into my mind, do you imagine that less sort of weird cultures, less Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic cultures, that they might have more capacity to make use of this diversity do you think? I don't know really, but I was just sort of wishing
there are people out there that are studying this. I unfortunately do not study that, but I do know what you're asking, and that I have seen that sort of conversations happening is that other cultures don't make people make eye contact. That's not that's where some of the cultural models. So there's a social model, a medical model, and a cultural model that's discussed. And the evolutionary stress framework sort of integrates all of those models. Because they're all important facets of the whole.
Well, yes. So as a matter of fact, say some more about the evolutionary stress model.
So a lot of times evolutionary theory will talk about the mismatch and the functionality. So when we think of something being good or bad in a stress model, it's always the context. What's the context? Is a blueberry good or bad for you? It depends on the context. So there's linear science, which gives us absolute answers and facts, and that's great for certain phenomenon. But once you get to the human body and the human condition, you have to use nonlinear complexity. So we have to think of autism as a complex adaptive system, which then applies different rules. Exactly. Ask your question again.
I just want to hear more about the evolutionary stress framework.
And so the evolutionary stress framework, you have to think of it as a timeline. So there are evolutionary resources that we have disturbed, because of this linear model that we were in. So if you're in a linear model, you are bound to make mistakes because you're applying linear mechanisms to nonlinear complex adaptive systems. So I always say germs, fats, and sunlight. So the germs was the microbiome. We thought the germs are a problem. We're going to take out germs. Became a huge problem with disrupting our microbiome. We thought fats were a problem, which they were. In a linear paradigm, we found out that, saturated fats were bad for us. But by trying to take them out of our dietary guidelines, we actually created, again, more imbalance. And even sunlight, we evolved with sunlight, we evolved with fats, we evolved with germs. So disrupting those are disrupting our current ability to manage stress. So this is why it's so important to that we shift to this new framework, because if we're going to move forward with precision medicine and individualized health, we need to understand neurodiversity. We need to understand this evolutionary stress and our evolutionary purpose. So autism for me is not a disorder in a deficit model. It's a disorder in a complexity model. And disorder is an essential element of any system, because you have to have disorder in order to have order. What you don't want is chaos. So chaos means you're under stress and you're going in different directions. You can't read your environment correctly. So we currently we're living in a modern world and we have all of these stresses, but because we're living in the wrong framework of medicine, we're also not making the right decisions to recalibrate ourselves.
It's
a lot. Sorry.
No, that's really fascinating. I must admit that it's taken me so long to finally emerge from the medical model, and I haven't quite completed that emergence, but I'm working on it. And it does talk about stress. It stresses me to think about how constrained that made me, how difficult it was for me to really appreciate novelty and strength and only look for something I could change, I could fix. It's really been a struggle for me, but it's really liberating to move out of it.
Even thinking in terms of trade-offs. Yeah, I think of autism as an adaptation with trade-offs.
Yeah.
And so, I'm living with too much information, so I have to manage that information and manage that stress. And I don't want to talk about stress like it's a bad thing. Stress is an evolutionary force. Stress is a communication channel in which we can operate in our environment. So I want to have stress in my life. I just don't want it to overwhelm me and to put me down a path that's going to be destructive for me or maladaptive for me in the long run. But I know we had a great conversation about the trade-offs we have and experience being autistic, or when people have synesthesia, or if you're a really focused scientist or musician or artist or writer. We've evolved with these characters and talents throughout history. And right now I feel like they're sort of the canaries in the coal mine, right? Like, we're stressing out our population in general, and these are the people that are being hit the hardest, and the kids that are being hit. So a lot of times when I talk to parents, they'll say, oh, I have the same traits. And I'm like, yeah, now imagine if you turn the dial up. So now they have even more of that intensity, but they also have the trade-offs, and they have to compensate for that lots of information and lots of intense interest. And sometimes those interests are also ways that we regulate stress. So I've seen so many teachers or well-meaning therapists that will take away a child's comfort, whether it's a chair or a toy or a game or being able to doodle. Like, teachers did not want me to doodle in class, but they could never catch me not paying attention, because doodling and not paying attention helps me pay attention.
Exactly. Oh, I really get that. And learning about behavioral cues really helped me communicate information like that, similar to that, to teachers. But say some more about these adaptations, because the conversations we had before were about, for example, children who have what is unfortunately called restrictive interests, know, and that is something that is really interesting to me and problematic, I think, to look at it as a negative, even though I agree that these children who are really good, for example, at numbers or at something else, and not so good at getting along with other kids, for example, that those kids suffer somewhat because they can be lonely, or they can feel that there's something wrong with them if they don't fit in with the group. But on the other hand, to give up their special gifts, their special capacities in order to try to fit in, that seems like a problem too.
We all want and need connection. The problem I have always seen and experienced is that people also like predictability.
Mm-hmm.
So we want everyone to be the same because that's easiest for us to understand. However, we do have to start expanding people's ability to handle difference and handle diversity without it feeling like a threat.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me, my intense interest was science and rules. I grew up not understanding other kids, but I homogenized to such a point that after reading that book, I told you I thought I was a stoic because I had put on a mask so thick that I thought that I had become normal.
Mm-hmm.
Even though when I went back to my high school friends, and when you sort of self-diagnose and you're sort of going through your autism diagnosis, it was a journey. It was a 2-year journey for me, and you have a lot of feelings and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of identity crisis. But I went back to one of my best friends and I told her that that I'm autistic, and she goes, "Oh, that makes so much sense." And I was like, it really does. Like, I had to reframe and realize I had this. That this was obvious to everyone around me, and yet I was in denial because you wanted to fit in so much.
Mm-hmm.
But had I had the opportunity to not have to fit in, I wonder what that would have looked like. Although I did have a lot of people in my corner during those times who did support my intense interest in science and rules and mathematics. So I was lucky in some ways, but also, yeah, you want to be able to fit in. And how can we change this narrative from survival of the fittest, this competitive normal, to having a cooperative and knowing that there are trade-offs to having that level of intensity of science, math, literature interests. Now, there is the conversation, and I feel like I know because I've heard many people would interrupt at this time and say, but my child has deficiencies, my child has problems, and they need help and they need services. And this is not in any way to detract from that, because some of the trade-offs that come into play, I also experience, as far as when you have that much inflammation and oxidative stress from having that chaos.
Yeah.
And if you want to call it cognitive dissonance of this happening, and you're using up energy trying to figure out what's wrong with you and what's going on with you, and you're closing down more and more, and you create further and further issues with the public, because I had more aggressive outbursts. I felt overwhelmed more often. I couldn't switch tasks very well. I had limited executive functioning. And I think even younger, if that stress and that overload hits sooner, you have even more extreme trade-offs. And that could be metabolic and immune issues and all sorts of things that are happening, because we have to think of stress isn't stress happened and this happened. Stress is a deep programming. It's an evolutionary force. So we have to get into talking about epigenetics and HPA programming and how to feel safe. And I love a lot of the researchers that are there to talking about safety, and even the polyvagal, even though
I know.
conflict with Lisa Barrett Feldman, who we'll probably talk about some point in this conversation, and energy regulation and interoception. But if we're not talking about how to create safety and how to manage and regulate stress and emotion, and we're just saying, oh, this is a problem behavior, as you know, that's a misconception as far as how to approach what's really happening internally with these kids, and even with myself. I needed more understanding and more safety, not more discipline and guilt.
Exactly. Oh, that's so true. It's so true. And you told me before something that really resonated, and it keeps coming up in my mind, and that is that empathy requires energy.
Yes.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah. I think Simon Baron-Cohen at one point had really pushed the empathy. Again, we like to think of there's going to be this one thing that will define autism. And as we're learning, if there's 5 different personalities and trade-offs, it's like a big giant calibus board. Like what are those old calculators called?
I don't remember.
Somebody will remember.
Yes, I
Abacus.
remember.
It's an abacus
Slide
board.
rule.
So there's all these styles and switches that get changed, and so
Uh-huh.
there's huge heterogeneity, of course, on the spectrum, as we all know. But when they said that it's a crisis of empathy, I would say it's a crisis of energy. So I know there are people on the spectrum that are the opposite of me. I'm a high systemizer. I believe there are high empathizers on the spectrum. So you have a lot of on either side of what is the average. So for me, when people say, oh, well, autistic people do have empathy, I'm like, well, I don't have empathy like other people do. I can feel when a math problem is wrong. So when people say, well, just follow your gut, I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, I don't feel what other people feel and that's where we can get to Lisa Feldman Barrett, because I was listening to a podcast by her and my mind just exploded because she talked about how our minds are not made for thinking. They're made for energy allocation, for energy budgeting within the body. And I was like, this is it. This is so key. And I know that what she's doing is revolutionary, but people don't know how to integrate it yet into what we know. And this for me is the key to it, is because my body's priorities, since I'm a systemizer, is different than empathizers or middle of the road empathizers or all the other variations out there, because I need different energy than other people do. And so when I get upset, it's not for the same reason other people get upset. When I feel like, oh, there's a pattern that's out of place here, other people are like, that sounds like, how do you even feel that? And I feel things differently than other people. I still have feelings like other people, but I can't read people the way other people can read them, because I don't have that instinct. I don't have that whether it's mirror neurons, whether it's default mode network, whatever it is in the brain, it's very different for me than it is for the average person. And even people who are on the same spectrum as me, they're the opposite on the spectrum. So understanding the spectrum has to become much more dimensional. I call it a multidimensional dartboard, because when we think of things in a binary, which is linear science, we always want to default to the simple way to think of it. We think of people having more or less autism. But if we start thinking of autism as this whole outside of the neurotypical and all of the different variation that's there, and we can really think of it in terms of, how does that person manage stress? What are their priorities? What are their energy issues? What are their safety issues? What's their environment? And how do we improve their environment to help them improve themselves? Because we can't just, again, we had this whole, I don't even know anymore, because I'm a little detached from reality, like that there are still therapists like yourself out there going, what's wrong with this person and how do I fix it?
Yeah, but it's really inspiring to hear you speak, because first of all, what I have come to think of as my way of working with kids on the spectrum is to find some way of joining where they are, and moving into their way of thinking and feeling as much as I can, which of course is limited. But it does give me a way of connecting, so that, and it's really exciting for me, because my mind grows as I am challenged to fit into a completely different way of thinking and making meaning of the world. So if a little guy tells me about 2 hotels in London that he went to, my mind goes to, well, maybe I could be at the Mayfair and you could be at the Royal London, and maybe we could make a little path between them so that we could find each other, even though, of course, that's not a typical way of thinking. I mean, typically you might say, well, why is he telling me about these hotels in London, or what does he mean? And of course, what he's thinking is not necessarily what I'm thinking, but I'm thinking, how can I use what he's giving me as a way of connecting, as a way of connecting with him?
Because we all need connection. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions with autism is like, oh, well, you're a loner, you would rather be alone. And I struggled with this because I get overwhelmed socially. It's a lot of energy, like you said, to feel empathy and to try to get into other people's shoes. And I try really hard, but it's exhausting. And then sometimes there's that threat of, okay, if I'm exhausted all the time, am I going to say something I don't mean? Because when I'm a big believer in, and we've talked about ultradian rhythms. So ultradian rhythms, and this is really important for me to follow because usually about after an hour and a half, I run out of energy from my brain, from my short-term memory, and then I get overwhelmed. And so then if I don't get a break, then I can't make decisions. I can't really reach into my short-term memory anymore. It's almost as if you're having this nice, simple conversation, and now all of a sudden all the words are jumbled up in a big puzzle in my brain. And I can't pull from things anymore. And I can still talk, but I feel like I'm not making sense anymore. But if I get a break every 90 minutes, then I have time to take that from the short term into the long term, and then recover all of my, serotonin, dopamine, all my neurotransmitters can re-regulate. And then I can get back to work again, or I can have a conversation and not feel overwhelmed. But if I don't follow those ultradian rhythms, and they're different for different people at different times in different contexts, but it's kind of wild to me that these are pretty well proven. The military uses it, corporations understand and know that they exist. And yet I hardly ever hear anyone in autism talking about this. So if autism is an energy crisis, we absolutely need to be using ultradian rhythms and understanding how to take proper breaks, or when someone needs a break, or when somebody's just having that day where they can't reach their executive function or their short-term memory. I always talk about how my ability to make decisions or understand what's happening around me is sort of like a fan. When I have all of my neurotransmitters firing, I have one single fan, and I can just follow all those decisions. And then as soon as I go into overwhelm mode, it's like that fan opens up. So before, where I had, like, you're doing the dishes, right? You're kind of an automatic pilot, right? You're not making that many decisions. You're just getting things done. But as soon as that shuts off for me, now I have 100 different decisions. Because if you think about all the little tiny decisions you have to make while doing the dishes, all of a sudden I have to make all of those decisions. Wow. So when I talk about being overwhelmed, there's no salience there. There's no priority. There's no ability to say, I'm going to filter everything out. I can't filter anything out. So I have to make all of those decisions. So you talk about exhausting, or why people on the spectrum seem like they're exhausted all the time. Imagine having to make all of those decisions and not having any kind of salient features of what's right or wrong. So I could probably go on a tangent here too, because I was thinking recently about personality and that too, because people will say, well, how do you feel about something? And I'll be like, I have 8 different feelings. How do I pick the one? And if I pick the wrong one, what if that person doesn't understand that I was just thinking out loud, kind of thing, that this could be a feeling I'm feeling, but I'm not sure what that feeling is.
Yeah. No, it's really fascinating.
It is fascinating.
It is totally fascinating. Another thought that might have something to do with energy, which you just got me to think about, is fears. Is the fears that kids on the autism spectrum often have, which are, a mother just emailed me about a child who suddenly became afraid of dinosaurs and spiders and things like that. Wasn't so afraid before. But now that you're talking about it this way, I think, well, this is the transition time of school. School, her beloved school is ending. She's going to prepare for a new school. She has to live through the summer. Maybe it also has to do with energy drain,
Being overwhelmed. Yeah, if you're overwhelmed, then things can seem a lot more fearful. I know when I first went through my first autistic burnout recovery, I realized I had layers of PTSD. Like, I was getting PTSD from every day, like going to the grocery store. And I go back to my safe foods during that time, because your body doesn't want anything new or any decisions or any, so,
Yeah,
but we
exactly.
get so deeply programmed by that sometimes.
Mhm. Well, tell me a little bit more about how Porges and Feldman Barrett don't fit together, because I'm so impressed by both of them and I want them to fit together in some way.
I always believe everyone can get along. And one of my favorite quotes is from William Blake, which is, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom," which for those of you who are Bull Durham fans, that I totally stole that from Susan Sarandon, but it is one of my favorite quotes. And it's because I think everyone goes down a road, and I'll be guilty of this too. It's like I'm developing this framework, but I want other people to develop it with me because I can't see where I'm wrong. I can only go down and make my assumptions and build on those primary assumptions. So for Lisa Feldman Barrett and Stephen Porges believes in the triune brain, which is, there's this animal brain, and then we grow and we learn. And so there's this fight between thinking and feeling, and that we have to overcome our feelings in order to think. And even as a small child, this never made sense to me, because
Right.
I knew that I had to follow my feelings, because when, especially as intense feelings as I had, intense in one way and then non-existent in other ways, it's kind of a wild experience sometimes. But if you can't trust your feelings, you can't trust your world. That's what stress is all about. Stress tells us when we need to be protecting ourselves and when we need to be making changes and adapting or shifting gears. So if the triune brain doesn't exist, which I think it's easy to misunderstand that you have to fight these two things.
Yeah.
And Lisa Feldman Barrett says it doesn't exist. And I know the science is there, and I love what they're doing, but I don't think it eliminates or disqualifies Porges's work.
Right. I don't either, really.
It won't. I absolutely don't think that it will. And that's the way of a lot of things. Like, I'm developing a nonlinear framework that doesn't eliminate linear models work. That doesn't eliminate the germ theory model of medicine. It just says this is okay for here, and now we have to expand it and build a different model so we can understand
Walter
the
Freeman
complexity
talked
of it
about the
all.
neuron, the axon of the neuron and the dendrites of the neuron. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's just that integrating. I mean, I get exhausted, not so much from empathy, although that can be exhausting too, but from integrating. My brain gets really stressed. But I'm so motivated to integrate that it's sort of worth the exhaustion. And I do have to take breaks.
Yeah. I know that there's some studies on empathy with doctors and that too, that sometimes not feeling empathy is important too. And I know there's someone that wrote a book called The Dark Side of Empathy, saying, and again, because we love to find a single thing and say, this is the best thing we can be.
Yeah.
So everyone's like, more empathy, more empathy, more empathy. And yet studies show that people who feel a lot of empathy also aren't as generous, or I don't even know what the studies say anymore. That's been a long time. But there's a dark side to empathy. Like, more empathy isn't better. It's, what are the trade-offs? What are the costs? And that there's going to be variation in society, that we want that variation. But we all want people to feel compassion and to be able to feel a level of empathy. So if we're stressing out our population to the point where people can't afford to feel empathy, that's a problem.
That makes so much sense. It really makes so much sense. So I guess this may be a very difficult question, but if you could think of just a few words of wisdom to offer parents of neurodivergent children, what would you tell them? Or teachers of them, or therapists of them, any caregiver, what would you tell them to help them not get in the way or not make mistakes, or
I think it's almost the advice of any good coach or business leader is your job. I'm going to probably talk a little bit about Brené Brown here, because I think what she does in talking about shame and guilt, and then that, your job as those those people in other people's lives is to create the best environment for them so that they can optimize their learning, their creativity. So, in a way, you're detectives and looking at your employees, your kids, your children, and saying, okay, I know that this is the way I want to do it, but what do they need at this time and in this context? That's one of the frustrating things I know some people have with as workers is, well, one time you can do this, why can't you do it the next time? Because a lot of neurotypical people really never have that burnout.
Yeah.
They don't have that energy drain. So for them, they can have a consistent skill. I won't necessarily have a consistent skill because one time I'll be able to do it, I'll have executive function, and the next time I won't.
Yeah.
So some of that advice is, imagine you have your dial turned up on the world, and how would you manage that energy, and how would you look at that? To quit thinking of things in terms of disorder and think of them as, again, those adaptation with trade-offs. And so, okay, well, this person has this set of skills, and we're all humans, we're all built of the same stuff. So what does it take to make this person safe and feel comfortable, and to push them and to challenge them? That's a great thing about having this new version or new paradigm of stress isn't something to be avoided. It's, oh, how can I find more stress in a more productive manner for this person?
Yeah.
So how do I build their resources? How do I give them challenges? How do I keep them, that stretch and balance, the stretch and change? And
how do I work to create an environment that will give them the stress they need to be motivated to grow, but also the support they need to take breaks to replenish their energy?
yeah, I think science calls this enriched environments. How do we create enriched environments? And we have to know, and this is part of building self-determination as well, and choice into it, is the more we understand stress mechanisms, the better we understand personalized stress, the better we understand neurotypes with trade-offs, the better we can understand that here are all of the different stress factors that are involved. What does each person need, and which type of layering do they need it in? We go to a doctor for a pill, and that's great. I always say that's like a marionette doll, right? A drug will pull one string. And a lot of times these drugs are actually helping some of the oxidative balances within the body and inflammation. So that's great, but that doesn't make a marionette dance pulling one string. We have to have the biopsychosocial nutritional model, which is part of the evolutionary stress framework I'm building, because we have to understand how those dynamics are involved in every single health condition. For me, neurodiversity isn't about autism and ADHD and just a nicer word for disorder. It's about truly changing our medical paradigm to first understand that there are neurotypes that handle stress differently and have different needs. And how do we build a medical framework to look at all of the different factors that go into the biopsychosocial and nutritional aspects of finding your own balance and health and enriched environments?
Boy, I could never have put it into words as beautifully as you just did. And I know I'm taking a lot of your time, but I just have one more question.
You're fine. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Okay. That is, I think about children in rural villages and in low-income countries, low to middle-income countries, and I think, well, if we use this kind of thinking, if we use this framework, maybe we can find some ways to create enriched environments for them. I mean, we're certainly not going to get them 30 hours of behavioral therapy a week, which is not a good idea anyway, I don't think. But maybe there would be a way of working with their families and their communities to open their human environment's minds to get to know them in a different way and get to support them in a different way. It's really such an exciting idea to me.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that your mind went there. And that's what I love about the evolutionary stress framework, is that it's going to open up opportunities for people all over the world. I feel like there's so many scientists like on the cusp of this. We all know that there's something wrong, that we need a change, and what's going to come of that, and the creative solutions that are going to be found, and just the different approaches. I love that idea, Alexandra. That makes so much sense to me, to create more opportunities in those small villages outside of, I mean, we talk about behavioral therapies. There's nothing wrong with them, but the same thing, it's the pill. It was one of those things that's easy to measure in a linear model. In an empirical model, you can measure behavior. Behavior begets behavior. But if we can step back and look at the holistic picture, there are other ways to change that behavior rather than directly approaching it. I think it's great to relearn habits. I think it's great to relearn skills, but if it's not in that larger context, that's where some of that trauma can happen with behavior therapies that we hear about. So it's really important to shift into this paradigm and neurodiversity paradigm, and how we can approach things from a different perspective, but it's also a perspective we all know. We all know love and nurturing and healthy food and healthy diets and healthy environments and healthy families and healthy communities. But, how do we integrate that into our medical system?
Exactly. We get distracted from that vital knowledge.
Yes.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this conversation, Lori. I just look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. And I know our listeners will really benefit from this.
Yeah.
From
it's kind of amazing that we need advanced physics to understand the core basic things, but we do. And yeah, I'm looking forward to again, what this next generation is going to do with this knowledge that we build.
So thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us in this wonderful episode of the Supporting Child Caregivers Podcast. Please listen to us next week when we will have another episode in our Kids and ASD, but now I really want to say neurodiverse series, Neurodiversity. Please also remember that I will respond to your questions in my next Ask Me Anything episode, so send me your thoughts and questions at any time on the email sccinc2017@gmail.com. If you like this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Alexandra Harrison, and remember, the children of the world are our future.